Welcome to this session of the Ancestral Healing Summit with my guest, Dr. Nicole Gruelle. Our topic today is Awaken Your Samurai Spirit. Dr. Nicole Gruelle has a doctorate in integral and transpersonal psychology, and she's also an author, speaker, mama, multiple near-death experiencer, and specialist in spiritual health who descends from a 450-year lineage of samurai. She inspires people to harness their spiritual and transformative experiences for life prosperity, joyful livelihood, and to become the agent of awesome they were meant to be. Nicole, I'm so looking forward to our conversation. Welcome.
Lisa, it's always a pleasure. I love the Shift team. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad. I've been looking forward to this conversation since I first heard about this months ago. So let's go ahead and dive right in. I want to hear all about your samurai lineage. So let's start. When did you actually find out about this? How old were you? And when you first learned, were you even interested, or did you have to get a little older before you even cared?
Yeah, I didn't, I guess like anyone in their culture, it's just part of what you're born into. And so you don't question things. It's how the family is. And from a young child, every year I spent time over in Japan, at least for a month or so. And so I got very strongly connected to my family there. And they were a family with a bit of history. That much I understood from being a young age. There was even one family home that was about 400 years old that was in the area and was one of those big traditional ones that had to be built with special woodwork and thatching, etc. It doesn't stand anymore, But so I understood as a kid that there was something very old and ancient and grounded in that space. But it wasn't until much later that I really had any further interest in understanding ancestry, genealogy, my roots. And it came about as a bit of a surprise pathway, actually, in my own evolution as a being, and particularly when I went through some quite strong spiritual transformations. And I mean, this summit is about ancestral healing. And there came a point in my life just before I was 30 where I had a spontaneous experience for 3 days where I shifted in and out of regular consciousness and non-ordinary states of consciousness. I was literally lying on a couch going in and out of these states. And I hadn't taken any substance or anything like that. It just occurred, but it was time. It was time for my spirit and my mind and my body to process things. And it was during that 3 windows that those 3 days of a window where my doorway to ancestry was truly opened. And it's like almost out of a Disney movie, that moment where they say, remember who you are. It was one of those kind of experiences where I had to peel through layers on both my mother's side and my father's side. The samurai comes from my mother's side, but I had to peel through a lot of the dross and a lot of the ick and the stuff that had got me bogged down in my present life and heal some traumas. And by doing that, it naturally opened up this pathway to ancestry to say, and this is where your DNA is. This is where the stories are. This is what has come through you combined into the present moment. And so that was really the doorway to then say, okay, and there's samurai in there. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's actually what I wanted to ask next is what did you find out? I mean, because, I don't know if you're like everybody, like the average person, where samurais are characters in movies and they're always like male warriors, and you don't really think about possibly having that in your own lineage. So when you discovered that this is who your ancestors were, I assume that you really dug into learning more about the culture. What did you learn in your research?
Well, exactly as you say, in my mind, it was a male-dominated picture. And even the movies that you have in Japan and some of the ones that Hollywood has taken on, it's all the men and doing the fighting and the warriors. And so when I understood that this came through my grandmother's lineage, my mother is an educator. I have been an educator, and my grandmother was an educator. And so that was the first question of, well, how does that relate? And as I started digging with my mother, and fortunately we have one distant relative who's done the whole genealogy, and she's traced it back up to 450 years now. And so what they discovered was the women in the samurai families were actually the educators. So a samurai education is very whole and complete from when they are a child. They're born into, it was a caste system that was there in Japan. So you would have the ultimate landlord that, you know, controlled the region. And then you would have those who are in service to him, kind of like knights or bodyguards. And that was the role that the samurai played. They crafted their entire life in service to that master or that lord. And everything was provided for them. And it wasn't just a martial art, physical way of being. This was also spiritual. It was emotional. It was an entire person who was crafted. And so that education, of course, begins with the mother who raises the child in the home. And there are core principles. There were unwritten rules and codes and principles about what it meant to live a samurai kind of life. And you know, you don't get a guidebook when you grow up and say this is the way, right? And then you go and do this lesson and that lesson. It was just intrinsically built into who they were. And then, of course, as the children grow, and particularly the male children, then they would learn more of the physical things and go with the fathers and carry on in the physical fighting. But the women also had a special knife that they would carry with them as well. And one of the key things that distinguished the samurai was this sense of honor, personal honor and integrity. And this is what I think is so romantic to this day about the samurai, what the, you know, the directors catch on to as well, is it's in their core of who they are. And so ultimately, when the moment came, if a samurai was ever captured or their integrity was questioned, they would end their own life. And this is a bit controversial as a modern day conversation because, of course, in the West, we look down upon suicide. Whereas in Japan, there's a particular romanticism and integrity about it where you get to choose the moment that your own will ends. So self-control. So all of these things are taught from a very early age. So the women are the educators, they bring that through. And so with my personal story then, as I started to dig in and understand who are these samurai, I got interested in who are they as families as well. What did that more intimate setting look like? Not just the bang bang fighting, but what was their day-to-day experience? And as I went through that, it really was about these codes and these principles and conduct. So there's a triad in this law, if you want to call it that. There's a code called the Bushido. And Bushido literally translates out to mean the ways of the military knight, because these were knights. These were not just soldiers or fighters. They had like status. And so their code, this triad, came down to wisdom, benevolence, and courage. And so when you put those three principles together, this was the foundation for all of the physical actions, all of the ways of conducts and the things that happened from then on. So as I started to understand the core of that, that's what it means to be samurai, to live according to that way of being. Things made a lot of sense to me. I understood my mother better. I understood my Japanese heritage. I understood Japan a lot better actually too, because even though we don't have living samurai today, we don't have people wielding their swords and going around, there's something so deep about the spirit of the samurai that continues to penetrate the people in their psyche. And I think we're at a time in the world now where it's far beyond limited culture of Japan. We can tap in collectively to a psyche and a way of being. And that's why I've become so passionate about that, understanding that this is actually a code of conduct that we can, if we choose to, live by.
Yeah, That's so beautifully stated. Thank you for explaining that. I'm also wondering though, because of course this is the Ancestral Healing Summit, how did this information, this new knowledge, how did it perhaps change the way that you looked at yourself? You mentioned that it changed the way that you looked at your mother and your mother's lineage, but how did it help to learn these things about who you are, like deep in your DNA, and what sort of challenges did it throw in front of you?
So definitely that healing window of time. In my present life, just around the age of 30, I was at a stuck point. And I describe it like a chapter of molasses. It felt like walking through molasses. It was just so thick and dark and icky and gooey. And it's because I'd had stuff happen in my life that I had not been ready to process, psychosomatically process at that time. There were some childhood traumas, there were some heartbreaks, there were some bits and pieces that had happened on my journey. And my body shut down. My body literally shut down at that point because it was, and anyone who's listening to this who has got to that point where maybe you've ignored the message or the call for some time, and if we do, we get sick. That's what happens, or something big and dramatic happens in our life to stop us in our tracks. So that's exactly what happened to me. I'd avoided the message long enough. So I was stopped by my own body. And in that process of going through, it was quite shamanic in flavor. I kind of went down my left leg, and that took me down into the feminine track. And I went down into my right leg, and that took me into the masculine track. And I met lots of ancestral beings in there. And we had conversation in terms of, who are you? What needs to be revealed at this point in time? Were there any wounds that your life ended with that were still carried through to the DNA that can be addressed in this point in time, in this moment? So that was this spontaneous process that just happened and cleared. And so I learned so much about myself at that time in terms of what makes me who I am. Not only this current entity that I call Nicole, or who I think of as I in the present moment, but as I became very still to that and actually had that peeled away from me, it enabled me to access, and who have I been and where have I come from? What is the legacy that I am standing on, and the history that I'm standing on that I must acknowledge because it is part of what has constructed me today. And the more I can understand that, the more I can stand strong in who I am, what I represent, to then walk forward. So, as a personal healing practice, this connecting with ancestry is immensely powerful. And living in a global culture that we do today, I think this is something that, unless you're born into a culture that's pretty intact, or a family that's quite connected to culture already, this can just be missed. This can be completely missed. And that it's almost dangerous, because it's like a tree with no roots in that way. So that's the beauty of healing and connecting to ancestry, is we discover, we're like, oh, I have roots. First of all, I have roots. And now I get to discover what is the flavor of those roots. Where are the gnarly bits in the roots? Where are the deep parts? Where are the shallow pieces? Because each of these, it's not just a culture, these are people who have lived before us with stories, and perhaps pieces of their own lives that was unfinished and unprocessed. And that's all a part of our story. And then, of course, we have these conversations these days. We fully acknowledge that there is memory that is carried through the DNA. There are patterns and cycles that, in the field of psychology, we recognize. If we haven't addressed certain things, then habits repeat, cycles repeat. Even if ourselves personally, it wasn't something that happened in this lifetime, when our cultural roots have had wounds, some scars, injuries that have not been addressed in some way, they're going to filter through, consciously or unconsciously, into the present day. So I really did learn for myself that the more awareness I can bring to one's ancestry, to one's roots, and to be open and honest about some of the atrocities that might have happened. I mean, for me, I'm talking about a warrior class of samurais. I mean, these essentially were people who killed other people. We're talking about ending the lives of others. That's massive. So that comes with its own baggage as well. And if I'm simply looking at the beautiful aspects of that and romanticizing parts of culture, that would not be a complete picture either. So, for anyone as they're looking into their ancestral tracks, I think this is something that we can be eyes wide open with, in terms of who are my people, really, and what effect has that had? And then in the global picture today, what role have they played? And what role can they play through me as a current living being of that in a way that is positive as possible? So yeah, the personal journey was beautiful. I got to see, my grandmother, her mother, dig through the photos, find out that we went back to about 1550 with this family, and that story came from a group of warriors who were set to look after this big temple complex and the lord of that temple in an area called Ueda. So these are some of the pictures of that. And here's the beauty of ancestry when you start digging as well. I also found out that that lineage of samurai were also tasked to look after a temple complex, and that temple was a Shinto shrine, and it's dedicated to the spirits of fertility and fulfillment. And I really laughed when I found that out, because I'm a current life coach, and I work with people bringing through the spirit of the samurai in terms of discipline and, integrity. But at its core, the message that I want to share with people is life fulfillment, and this abundance that one can live in a fertile cosmos. And so I thought, gee, it's just written in the DNA. My life's actually very predictable.
Well, it also sounds like you've taken the aspects that you've discovered about samurai in general and channeled it down a more feminine expression. And I'm wondering, because you are a mother, how does this knowledge about who you and your family are, how would this change perhaps how you raise your own kids? What are you teaching them that you might not have learned because this wasn't, it wasn't a topic of conversation when you were growing up?
I think it really comes down to those principles and ways that one can live life. So I remember as a youth, I really hungered for some kind of a code of conduct. I wanted the rule book of life to say, if I just follow these principles, I'll be okay. And I never really received that. So I had to look for it in different places. And so there's a joy to me to find that actually I come from a culture who already gives that, and to keep it as simple as a triad like wisdom, to stick in lived experience, knowledge that comes from the lived experience of things, that wisdom, that headspace, benevolence, to do good, to be good, to come from goodwill and a good space, and then the courage. And I call this triad, for me, in simple language, head, heart, and hara. Hara is the term in Japanese that's kind of that core belly center, as three major energy centers in the body. And that for me is a daily practice. That's something that, I'd love to gift over to listeners as well, in terms of this is how we can connect within our own being to the samurai spirit. The head as an energy center, we know we have connection to infinite intelligence from this space. We are incredibly wise, savvy beings with our own genius, each of us. Heart, I mean, thanks to Heart Math and others, we understand the power of the heart space and living in resonance with one another, in harmony with other beings, etc. So when we can live from that heart space and do the right thing from that, life is just magical. But then, of course, this lower area, which in the West we don't tend to connect with much. We kind of live either from our hearts up or our necks up. And so I think a missing link is this belly wisdom. And particularly as a woman, as a mama, um, connecting with the belly space, the womb space, and the power that we have from that center is immense. And for men and for women, it's different, right? The feminine experience of the belly space is very different from the men's, but they're equally potent, you know. So from that core center comes courage, comes strength, comes will. And this is also why the samurai, at the end of the day, if they had to end their life, would take a sword and put it into their belly, and do what is called harakiri, the cutting of the stomach, because they believed the belly is where the soul resides. And we can debate where the soul resides. Different cultures and wisdom paths, you know, say that in different ways. But I guess from a samurai perspective, this wisdom, head, benevolence, heart, and courage, hara, head, heart, hara, is truly a pathway that very simply we can align to in a moment. And I do this on the regular. If there's something, if I feel I need to get recentered, I did it at the beginning of this call to connect, you know, it's just a boom, boom, boom. And we can connect that even more strongly if we want to the central sun of our cosmos, our universe, and the central sun of planet Earth. And so it's like this golden sword, almost this golden thread that can weave through and just keep us in line, in integrity. And so as a mother, as a woman, this is something that I feel, well, I walk now, you know, it is an embodied practice. And so I would hope that with my own young ones, it's something that I can instill through motherhood in terms of how to walk the world. How do you be with other people? How do you deal with challenging moments so that you don't have to just have a total meltdown, but you can actually stand in integrity and truth and clarity. And it's a very graceful way to walk the world once we learn how to do that.
Is that something that you can actually sort of walk us through for people who are watching this going, this sounds fascinating. How do I do it?
I'd love to. I'd love to. So, literally, that's it. You can use your visualization if you want. I find visualizing a gold ball really helpful, and not like a hard gold ball, but something that's a bit kind of, you know, when you get a glass of water and gold paint and you stir it together and it's a bit soft. So, think of kind of soft gold like that. So if you can, and you can even close your eyes and do it right now if you want to, you know, to visualize in that headspace, one of those big gold balls or like a big auric ball. And this is your wisdom. This is your seat of wisdom and knowledge. Everything that you have lived through, you have experienced, and you have gained life lessons from. This is something that inhabits this space. And now you can imagine another big kind of bauble around your heart. And you can expand this out if you want to, you know, get playful with this. And so the heart space is, you know, we breathe, we open it up. This is our pulse. You know, when we're that tiny embryo inside our mama's belly, this is where it all begins with the brain pulse, and with the heart pulse, this is where it starts. And then the next little pulse that comes in is the belly, right? These are the core pieces of how we actually begin as a human embryo. And so, you know, you can expand that heart space, and it's as simple as having the intention to connect to the heart, open the heart, breathe through the heart. And then imagine a third big golden ball around your belly. And so this is your seat of personal power, of will, of I. And I'm not talking about this from an egocentric point of view, like, you know, the selfish I, mine. It's a powerful position. You are an individual being. And yes, you are connected to a wider collective of beings in an interconnected fabric in this cosmos. And yet you are still whole as an individual. You get to make decisions. You get to have choices until the moment you're no longer in your physical body on this planet. You get to make choices. And our will is the final thing that we hold on to as humans before we end our life. You know, once we decide that that's gone, this experience that is the physical experience of being human. That's it, it's done. So that is what lives in this belly center. And again, you can breathe through this space, breathe through it now. Put your feet onto the ground, go barefoot, and feel the earth breathing up through you into your belly space, into your heart space, into your head space, and allow that breath to activate those points and get connected more and more with them, get stronger and stronger with the breath. And then if you want to take it that step further, you can now imagine that there's a beautiful golden thread or cord or rod between those centers, and one extends all the way up to the sun, up in the sky, that source of power and heat and light, and another connects all the way down to the central sun in the core of our planet Earth. And this is like a super activation process. This will probably get you quite activated and alert. You might find yourself sitting with a very straight spine as well. And it's just a beautiful way to keep all the pieces in check. So that if something's blowing up in front of you, or you have a confrontational moment, you can take 5 seconds to breathe with this, connect in super fast, and just say, do I feel aligned in head, heart, and hara? And I can promise you that when you feel that alignment of those three, bang, 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 you will be making decisions from a better space. Better words will come out of your mouth. There will be, because you're in integrity, you're connected to the core of who you are. And so when we do that, we simply make better choices. Yeah.
I can feel the power in your words, even though we're distracted by cameras and conversations, etc. Not even being able to fully drop in, I can absolutely feel the power in your words. So I will absolutely be applying that. Thank you for sharing that. That was beautiful. Now, I also wanted to ask you. You mentioned earlier, this is something that intrigues me. The fact that we don't all necessarily live where our ancestors their homeland, like you said, your half of your lineage comes from Japan, and yet you live in an entirely different continent. How do the two cultures, like from your father's side and your mother's side, do they clash? Do you find as you're doing genealogy, ancestry research, are you discovering solutions for perhaps warring sides of your ancestry?
Yeah, I love that question, Lisa. So my father's side is actually French, and my parents met in Mexico. They were both kind of black sheep of the family themselves. And it's interesting in my own personal voyaging of that and where they came together, because it's typical of East and West. It's an East meets West story and combines together in one being who was born in Australia. So my life story from a young age was one of displacement and wanting roots and belonging. And I really wanted an answer to the question, where is home? Where is home? And not just a physical space, obviously, but that feeling. And those of you listening, if you know home for yourself, you know that that's a felt thing. You're on the land and you're like, this is home. And for those of you that have never felt it and feel quite ungrounded, as I have for most of my life, that's also a very real feeling of where is home. And so when there was a bit of a clash, actually, of cultures, there's both a harmonizing and a clash. I think there's so much wisdom that comes through both East and West that I have tried to integrate within this lifetime. So, I end up in a field like transpersonal psychology, which is bringing together different wisdom pathways from around the world to find what are the common themes in that make us human. Yeah. But some of the clashes, again, in that 3-day experience that, I went in and out of ordinary states, I actually ended up writing a book from that called Dancing with Dragons, because I felt like I was encountering dragon-like archetypal energies that were clearing through different points of my chakra system, different points of my being. and clearing the stuff out of the way. And the more I then got to understand this energy of dragons, I learned, well, of course, in the West, dragons are looked at as this fierce force that you go and you slay. It's a bad thing, and you have to conquer the dragon. And in the East, they love dragons. They're good luck charms. They bring prosperity. They're the source of greatest wisdom and strength. And so that again was another moment where I had to laugh in my own life and say, isn't that interesting? Bringing together these archetypal forces that come through, again, the DNA that are clashing in this moment, but where I can also find the harmony in them. So, I walk forward with ancestry and culture as a very kaleidoscopic experience. There's nothing black or white about ancestry. There are layers. There's always layers, and there are stories, and there are going to be really positive aspects that one can bring through and hopefully emphasize. And there's going to be stuff, there's going to be stuff to deal with, and ugly chapters as well. I mean, we in the modern world, and especially, living in the kind of, what would you call it, the modern societies that we do that are built on the degradation of so many different ancestral tracks and histories.
Right, colonization.
Until this is recognized, until this is righted, until this is healed truly, and we no longer bury our heads in the sands about all of the wrongs and atrocities that have been committed, we cannot walk forward clearly. And yes, of course, there's that argument of, I didn't do anything in my lifetime. What do I have to address? Hey, I grew up in Australia. I understand that conversation. That happens loud and clear here, like it does in the Americas, like it does everywhere in the world has been touched by colonization, everywhere. And so until we current people who carry the threads and the stories of the DNA, the good stuff and the ugly stuff, until we can acknowledge that we living beings, as guardians of those stories and as shapeshifters of those stories, until we have the power and recognition to sit in our space and say, I can be one of those change agents, and to then take the steps and do it. Until we can do that collectively, I think we're going to remain in these loops and cycles, that often carry out unconsciously. And that's a great tragedy, because we can do so much better. We can do so much better.
Absolutely. And I actually think that's why ancestral healing is, it's not just the Shift Network who's noticing that this is happening. People are waking up all over the world, realizing that we are the living faces of our ancestors, and some of them were wonderful, loving, giving people, and some of them not so much. So even though, as you said, I didn't do it, that doesn't mean that I don't carry some sort of, a genetic ripple effect from what's been done by the people who came before me. And even though my specific ancestors didn't live in North America during the time of colonization, that doesn't mean that my ancestors didn't do something equally as heinous, where they were from. So we do need to take responsibility for each other. And I think having compassion for other people's stories as they're learning their backgrounds and going through the experiences, like you said, you had that 3-day period of what the heck is going on with me. We're all sort of going through those growing pains right now. And I really love the way that you tell how this happened to you and what you've done with it.
And truly, the world in many ways is getting smaller. We're becoming more aware of each other and these stories. And so this pressure to address these things is becoming more front of mind for some people. And it's courageous. It is very courageous to face a painful history and to fess up in many ways, or to even look at it, or to acknowledge, here's how I've benefited in the modern day from a story that has happened and things that have been taken away from others. Simply that acknowledgement is very powerful, because until the suffering stops on this planet, and there are many people suffering for reasons that don't need to be happening right now, we can do this as a collective. You know, when we shift individual responsibility onto individuals and say, well, that's your issue to deal with, so deal with it, that's your trauma, we're not acknowledging that we have a level of us, every single one of us, that is interconnected as well. We have a personal sphere to deal with, but we have an interpersonal sphere. We are a species together. And so we must address those multi-layers. And so it's hard. It can be hard work. It's complex. It's deep. You know, these are big rabbit holes that for some people, once they open up, it can be incredibly overwhelming. And I think so in my own personal experience, that's a perfect example where clearly I had not been ready. I didn't even know what I wasn't ready to deal with. I didn't even know, but a wiser part of me did. Thank goodness. And when it was time, as uncomfortable and awful as it was to have my whole life shut down, that was what was needed in that moment to allow a healing to come through. And there's nothing neat and tidy about healing. You know, it's not. So my hat off to people who consciously choose to walk that path and address things, because there's nothing easy about it. The gift, though, is after the mush of the caterpillar. And if we are able to walk through with it and bear it and be with the process and the unknown aspects of it and the discomfort, if we can ride that out, there is something on the other end of that. And there are more than enough people that have lived through it to the other side to tell you that, that there is something better that emerges on the other end, because a healing, like any wound, you know, we're scarred. It's there with us. It remains on our body and our being, and yet we can come out of it stronger, more resilient, wiser. And this is how we become the elders eventually, because we've lived through, you know, and that's how we get to share with others. So it's important that we do our ancestral healing if and where needed. Absolutely, because it's going to strengthen all of us. Yeah. And the way you do it really is, you know, this is the exciting part, where you get to dig into your own story. And again, this is where people are quite ungrounded. And when we don't know our own ancestry in this modern day and age, there is a temptation to latch on to cultures that draw and attract us, that might have nothing to do with who we are. And I get that that is useful in understanding a pathway that is resonant with oneself. And perhaps there's past life history there, or who knows, you know, I don't know, that's a whole other kind of conversation, right? When we get into reincarnation and other cultures. And so if that's your path, go right ahead. And at the same time, I would really suggest to look into your own ancestry. What are the cultures that you stem from, and what is their history? Because there are keys for us within that, in terms of who we are and how we can conduct ourselves, that are unique to us and what we can bring through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. Again, beautifully stated, and it's taken me down another path I want to ask you about. As I was mentioning a minute ago, that you know, I'm living on land that belonged to an entirely you know, a race of people who'd had their land stolen from them. So I feel that I bear some responsibility toward, you know, respect and doing any kind of reparations that are possible, etc. But I'm also interested in what you were talking about when you went back to Japan and you were walking on the lands where you know that your ancestors did walk, and you're not culturally appropriating anything, you are actually connecting with your own family's culture. So I'm wondering, what did it feel like for you when you were actually in Japan, walking in your ancestors' footsteps? That's one of my favorite things to experience. What was that like for you?
It is like a homecoming. There's something very nurturing and stable and comfortable about that, I've found. And the deeper I dig into this lineage and understand more and spend time on that land, there's a deep resonance and connection with it that goes beyond words. Certainly, there's just a feeling of standing in a temple, for example, that has been there for hundreds of years, and you know that there are people that are part of your line that have stood in that same place. And my curiosity naturally opens up to, who were they? What were they doing here? When were they here? What were they thinking? What were they feeling? Who are they as a human being? And I'll never know the answers to that, truly. But there's a deep comfort that comes in that, certainly. And so I find, as someone who comes from mixed heritage and lives in a country, again, where both of my parents were migrants coming here. So someone who has had a very ungrounded sense of roots and culture and yearned for that feeling of being able to go to at least one place in the earth where I feel that strong connection is very humbling. Very humbling, particularly when you go back hundreds of years. You feel this big, knowing how much history has been there. And any one of us can feel that in the presence, say, of a great tree, right? A tree that has been there for hundreds of years in a forest. We have been here in but a blink of an eye in the lapse of that tree. So, or the stars, these are those moments of awe when you can really just say, wow, so much has happened. And my life is this big in the picture of all of that. And very humbling. and beautiful too, that the acknowledgement, and yet here I am. And what do I get to do with this? I'm here. What now?
I think this is a beautiful place to go ahead and put a pin in that, and sort of, let's see what we can wrap up as far as, if you were going to offer advice to the people who are watching as far as how to apply samurai wisdom in their everyday life, what would you suggest?
Connect with your head, your heart, your hara, so that you feel in alignment with the core of you. And that will take you to a place of your own integrity, so that when you walk the world from that space, when you speak, when you bring your thoughts forward and your deeds through your hands, you are in alignment. And life will be easier from that space. And I think having tools like that, if that one works for you from a samurai line, great. If you have your own, great. Again, this is resonance for yourself. But I think the key is having a pocket full of tools like that, because this modern world that we are living in is full of incredible challenges. We're living in one of the craziest times right now. Things are just shifting so fast. And there are big unknowns that we are all staring into at this point in time. And it's so easy to become ungrounded within that. And so call on your deep roots, call on your strength, find your ancestral pathways, find the tools that belong deep in your DNA that are going to help keep you grounded in times where the storms are around. And that will help you navigate day by day, moment by moment, whatever's coming up. And the beauty of that is, as long as you're in integrity with yourself, you can look back years later and you know that in the moment, I did the best I could in that moment. I might do different now. I might make different choices. Gee, I wish I knew now. I wish I knew then what I knew now. We can have hindsight and all of that. But if we have integrity in the moment, we can't go wrong in that way, because we can always look back and just say it was the best I could do at that moment in time. And that genuinely in your heart and mind to be true. That's the key as well. And if we can do that, we die peaceful. We're more at ease in our hearts and our mind. It's like there's a surrender that can happen with that. And that's how life becomes just that step easier.
Yeah,
Yeah.
excellent advice. Thank you so much for sharing that. I want to make sure, speaking of sharing, that I share your website before we wrap this up, and that is drnicolegruel.com, and that's one word, everything smashed together. There's no period after doctor. And so, if people were to visit your website, why don't you go ahead and tell people what they will find there?
Sure. So the first thing you will find is hopefully a happy smiley face welcoming you. You'll also find my latest book, The Power of Notes: How Non-Ordinary Transcendent Experiences Transform the Way We Live, Love, and Lead, as a free download. So go ahead and grab that. It's a resource for being with the extraordinary in your own life and using it as your ally, using your spiritual experiences as your ally, using your transformative experiences, positive or distressing, as your allies to live your best life. And very practical. You can read it in a day if you're really keen, but that's there as a resource for you to walk forward and live your best life. So that's a free thing you can go in there and claim. And of course, there's a bunch of articles and videos and interviews and things like that with amazing people talking on lots of wonderful topics. Yeah, and I look forward to connecting.
All right. And who doesn't love free stuff? Thank you for offering that. Well, Nicole, I'm so glad that you were able to make time to talk with us today. I had such a great conversation with you in the Beyond the Veil Summit, and I knew when you mentioned the samurai lineage that I had to interview for you for the Ancestral Healing Summit. So again, I want to thank you so much for being with us. I want to ask before we go, is there anything that we forgot to talk about or anything else that's popped into your mind since we started that you want to make sure we talk about, or do you feel complete?
The only thing I would add to say to people is if there's a niggling within you to connect to ancestry, because this is in the context of talking about ancestral healing in this summit, if there's some kind of a niggling in you that there's something I want to explore, go and satiate that curiosity. Go and do that and find out, because you never know what you're going to unravel once you go down that pathway. There are human stories that are begging to be explored, that we are all connected to, and we are so interconnected as beings. And as we unthread those pieces more and more, we get to connect with each other on really beautiful levels. And not only do you get to learn more about yourself, you get to even help unravel that for other people as well. And that's a massive gift, a massive gift. So carry on.
Absolutely. And I dare say that niggling, at least in my experience, that niggling you feel is probably one of your ancestors tapping you on the shoulder saying, I have a story to tell you.
I love that. I love that.
Well, once again, I want to thank you, Dr. Nicole Gruel, for joining us today. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this conversation in the Ancestral Healing Summit.